Hello, I'm Pastor Bobby Morris, pastor of Mount Pilgrim Lutheran Church in Prosperity and professor of Old Testament and Hebrew at our Lutheran Seminary in Columbia. I'm joining you in this video to speak with you about something that is on your minds and probably on your hearts. The terrible conflict that is raging in the Middle East. The ongoing Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I'd like to take this opportunity to speak with you and give those events some historical context, some background, to help you understand how it is that this is going on, how it is this is going on yet again. And while I hope to bring some clarity, again, to give some background and context to what you are seeing in the news, I hope also to perhaps take away some of the certainty you might have as to who's right or who's wrong, or what's the correct side to take. Because taking sides doesn't help. Taking sides is part of what's got us to the point where we are. And so while I hope to bring some clarity, I hope this presentation will also help to show you the complexity so that you might not be quite as certain of some things as you were. This topic holds a special place in my heart because I've been traveling to the Middle East, primarily to Israel, for over the last 20 years. And over half of that time I've spent teaching groups, taking groups to the holy sites and giving biblical depth and additional understanding to the entirety of Scripture. It's a great joy to me to see people's reactions, to see people experience this land and these people, and to have their understanding of the world, of Scripture, of God's presence and activity in the world enriched. St. Jerome once said that the story of Jesus is recorded in 5 Gospels. 4 of these Gospels you will find written in books. The 5th Gospel, however, is found in a land that's called holy. St. Jerome says, read the 5th Gospel and the world of the 4 will be open to you. And that's certainly the case. And part of the sadness of this current state of affairs is that so many people that would have been able to right now, in the past several weeks, right now, in the weeks and months to come, that we're going to be able to experience that 5th Gospel, will not be able to do so. So, to some historical background and context. What we know as Israel, Palestine, this area over its long history has actually seldom been a single, unified nation. Of course, this is the land that was promised to Abraham and Sarah. This is the land that the Hebrew slaves were led into after their release by the power of God from slavery in Egypt. It's the land that these people entered under Joshua. But it would not be, of course, until David and Solomon around the year 1000 BC that an actual Israelite kingdom with a king would be established. And that's by no means to say that the Hebrew people, the Israelites, were the only people here. If we go back a moment to the entry into the Promised Land after the Exodus. If you read the book of Joshua, you could come away with the impression that all the Canaanites, all the folks that were already there, were completely obliterated and flushed out by Joshua. Problem is, you turn the page after the book of Joshua to the book of Judges, and one of the first things you read is, oh, there were still lots of Canaanites in the land. So even after the entry into the promised land, even after the days of Joshua, when we get down to the time of David and Solomon, it's not the case that there were only Israelites in this land. That really has never been the case. There's always been a mixture, if you will, of inhabitants of this land. In terms of a single kingdom, state, if you will, in this place, that even under David and Solomon was very short-lived, because after the death of Solomon, there's a civil war, and we see the kingdom of Israel split into a southern and a northern kingdom. Hereafter, we refer to the southern kingdom as the kingdom of Judah, and it's the northern 10 tribes that continue under the moniker of Israel, the kingdom of Israel. Those kingdoms, those two kingdoms, would only last a number of centuries. After the death of Solomon, the north would only last until the year 721, when it was conquered by the Assyrian Empire, and much of the population was exiled, was scattered by the Assyrians. That was the Assyrian policy of empire. When they conquered an area, they took out forcibly many of the native inhabitants and brought in from elsewhere in the empire various other nationalities in a very intentional effort to water down the population, such that there would be no nationalistic ethnicity that could give rise to a revolt. This is the reason that when we read the pages of the Gospels in the New Testament, we read of the Samaritans and the disdain that southern Jews had for the Samaritans, the people of the north. Because of this policy of the Assyrians, the southern Jewish people looked at the northern Jewish people as watered down ethnically, not pure Jews. It wouldn't be much later until the southern kingdom would fall. In the years 586 and 587 BC, the southern kingdom would fall to the Babylonian Empire. Jerusalem would be destroyed, its walls leveled, its temple even destroyed and burned. So already we see over the span of a wide range of time in the ancient world, there was a very short period where we have a unified single Israel in this land. After that 586, 587 destruction by the Babylonians, much of the population was exiled to Babylon, and it would be a good 4 or 5 decades later when those exiles from Babylon would be allowed to return thanks to the edict of Cyrus the Persian. This brings us to the point of biblical books like Ezra and Nehemiah, where we read of that return happening and the walls of Jerusalem being rebuilt and even the temple being rebuilt. However, at this stage, there still is not an independent kingdom of Israel. This area is still under the very clear political, economic control of the Persian Empire, even though exiles are being allowed to return from Babylon in order to rebuild the city, rebuild the temple. This is still the Persian Empire. That would only give way in the 300s BC to the Greeks under Alexander the Great. Still have Jews here, still have a temple, still have Jerusalem, but this is part now of the Greek Empire. There would be a very brief period under the Greeks in the 160s BC when there would be a temporary reestablishment of an independent Jerusalem, an independent Judah under the Maccabees. but it was very short-lived, round about a century or so, that would give way to the Roman Empire. And once again, Israel would not be an independent nation as such. It would just be a part of a larger Middle Eastern empire. It really is the story of Israel across the centuries BC. One national power, one empire to another, holding sway, ruling over this area. The next major change under the Romans comes in the year 70. We're in the AD era now, or CE, the Common Era. In the year 70, there was a Jewish revolt against the Romans, and that revolt was rather decisively put down by the Romans. The temple in Jerusalem was destroyed once again, and it's never been rebuilt since. Much of the city was laid waste, and the revolt was very summarily crushed by the Romans. At this point, some of the Jewish population flees, is expelled from Jerusalem, but not completely. It would not be until the year 135, the Bar Kokhba revolt, which was also summarily put down by the Romans, the Emperor Hadrian. But after the Bar Kokhba revolt in 135, what's key in that particular instance that's a little bit different from the revolt that was put down in the year 70 is that Hadrian made every effort to flush all of the Jews out of Jerusalem and surrounding areas. Essentially, the Romans were sick and tired, fed up with these annoying revolts in this little backwater of the Roman Empire by the Jews. And so he actually renamed Judah Syria Palestina. That's where we start to actually get the reference to this area being Palestine. And it was because of Hadrian's effort to erase any physical presence or even geographical reference to this area being tied to the Jewish people. This is also when we start talking about, in earnest, a diaspora, a scattering of the Jewish people. Because again, Hadrian, the emperor, wanted to drive these people out of the environs of Judah, of Jerusalem, to scatter them, to get rid of them. And that's largely what we see taking place. It's from this point on, from the years 70, but particularly 135 AD, that we find a real effort, in this case by the Romans, for Jews to be driven out of this land. Now, the Roman Empire, of course, continues until the year 476, when Rome falls to the barbarian hordes invading from the areas around Europe. However, much of the Roman Empire, the eastern part, continues as the Byzantine Empire until the year 638. Now, all during this time, there still is no independent kingdom of Israel, as there really had not been since, with the brief exception of the Maccabean period in the 150s, 160s BC, that there had not been since the days of David and Solomon. The key thing that happens in the year 638 is that now there's no longer a Roman Empire, there's no longer a Byzantine Empire. 638 marks the beginning of the Muslim period. That's the major turn of the year 638. And really from 638 all the way down to 1918, 1919 really, getting more close to the doorsteps of our own time. That's the Muslim period, where we have various Muslim dynasties in control of the entire Middle Eastern region. beginning around the year 1071. For example, we have the Seljuk Turks, one dynasty of Muslims. For a very brief period, from about 1095 to 1291, that's the Crusader period, where for roughly a century, the Holy Land was under Christian control. Now again, still, there is no state, there is no kingdom as such, and certainly not a Jewish one. So that hadn't changed. But even that is very short-lived, and in 1291 we have the beginning of what's called the Mamluk period. We're just talking about essentially another dynasty of Muslim control of not just the Holy Land, but the whole environs of the Middle East. 1517, a year that's not only important for the Reformation, but 1517 is also the year when we have a shift in the Muslim control of the Middle East to the Ottoman Turks. And that's going to bring us down to the modern era, because the Ottomans, the Ottoman Empire, is what would be in place in the Middle East until World War I. And that's what this map illustrates. If you look, this is modern Turkey, modern Iraq, modern Iran. This is the area of modern Saudi Arabia, the country of Jordan, Syria, and of Israel. But one thing I want you to notice from this map and this depiction of the Ottoman Empire, which again, the borders, if you will, shifted between 1517 and World War I. If we back up, this is the early 1900s. If we back up the timeline a few centuries, you can see Egypt here is indicated under British control. But in the 1800s, 1700s, the Ottoman Empire would even have included much of what we now know as Egypt. The point being, though, is that during all these centuries, 15, 17, all the way until World War I, even though this map shows Iraq, Syria, what I want you to notice is there are no countries of Iraq, Iran, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, or Palestine, or Saudi Arabia, or Jordan, and that's because as we know them, they did not exist. This was the Ottoman Empire, much as during the New Testament period, all of this would have been the Roman Empire, and there just were not the modern countries that we know now. Those are inventions of the 1900s, post-World War I. Because in World War I, the Ottoman Empire turned out to be on the wrong side of history. The Ottoman Empire was part of the losing side, if you will, of World War I. While World War I was still going on, in 1916, and this was in its initial stages, this was a rather secretive agreement that was struck primarily between England and France, and Russia was privy to some of the details, but not the full scope. The Sykes-Picot Agreement, which was basically a pact between primarily Great Britain and France, that in the aftermath of World War I, much of this Ottoman Empire would be divvied up between Great Britain and France. They would be the ones to control this area and determine its future. Also, in the background of World War I going on is another major document that's known as the Balfour Declaration. And it is a statement that was put out by the British government that basically pointed to, promised the Jewish people that in the midst and in the aftermath of World War I, that Great Britain would work towards the establishment of a homeland for the Jewish people. Now, why is this important? We don't have to wait until World War II to find a Jewish desire for a homeland. Going all the way back to the Roman period, remember, Jews have been scattered from the Middle East. And over the centuries, Jews, of course, became inhabitants of not just the Middle East, but also of Europe. But during this time, particularly as we get down to the 1800s, the late 1800s, we find some of the early beginnings of anti-Semitism. Jews came to be in Europe heavily involved in the financial businesses of the economy. Ironically, compared to these days, for much of our modern history, those who tended to the banking, the background workings of the economy, that was looked upon for much of modern history as kind of a taboo occupation, not something that someone respectable would be involved in. So let the Jews take care of that, the banking. Well, they did quite well with it. And so what the catch is, though, when an economy went bad, who got blamed? Well, the ones who were taking care of all the finances and the money. And so in the late 1800s, approaching the 1900s, for that and other reasons, we do see widespread persecution of Jewish inhabitants, of Jewish populations, and the beginnings of what we would call anti-Semitism. So there's already in the late 1800s, before World War I even gets going, of a desire to have a safe place, a homeland, a nation that is Jewish. That movement is called Zionism. One of the fathers of that movement is Theodor Herzl, as we approach the year 1900. So in the aftermath of World War I, as the Sykes-Picot Agreement had stipulated, the Ottoman Empire, this entire region, was divided up between England and France. And England and France would be the ones to largely dictate what this area would look like in the years to come. And it's in this aftermath of World War I, again, largely at the hands of England and France, that we get the modern boundaries that we have largely today drawn for countries like Iran and Iraq and Syria and Lebanon and Jordan. Again, countries that did not exist as such, with boundaries as such, prior to World War I, because this was all the Ottoman Empire. So it's a European post-World War I world that we see in this region now, with the Ottoman Empire reduced down to what we now know as the country of Turkey, and now the existence of these independent countries, Iraq, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and Palestine. The role that Britain and France were supposed to play was to supervise these areas as these new countries, nations were essentially being created. France and Britain were to manage, supervise these areas until they were able to exist on their own, independently. That was at least the plan. The problem is, as again, Europeans, outsiders, drew these boundaries, they did so without firsthand real knowledge of things like tribal loyalties and other such cultural phenomena that if you're not a native of the Middle East, you just don't know. And so that's just to say that some of the ongoing conflicts that we see across this region really go back to people that didn't know any better drawing boundary lines that perhaps were not drawn in the best of places. The part of this area that Great Britain ended up with to manage included Palestine. Great Britain had Palestine as a mandate, again, to manage until such time as it could govern itself independently. Now, while this is going on in the decades following World War I, we see a marked increase in Jewish immigration to what might be called Palestine. If you see here in 1922, this is just a few years after World War I concludes, total population in what we could call Palestine was less than 1 million people. About 600,000 of that was Muslim, about 83,000, 84,000 Jewish, and about 70,000 Christian. But as you pan down the chart here, 1931, the Jewish population is almost doubled. And by 1945, the Jewish population is already over 500,000. Now, the fact that there was 84,000 Jews in Palestine in 1922 should tell you that there was never a time where there was not a single Jew in all of Israel-Palestine. But likewise, remember, through all of those centuries after the Roman and Byzantine empires collapsed, you do have Arabs, Muslims here as well. So there was never a time really in modern or even recent ancient history when this land was empty, when there were no Jews or no Muslims here. That's just never been the case for many, 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 many centuries. So, we have the population changing drastically in Palestine post-World War I. Christian population increasing somewhat, Muslim and Jewish populations, though, increasing rather significantly, particularly the Jewish population. Great Britain still has this area as a mandate and are trying to figure out what do we do here? How do we handle this? The United Nations, of course, is a player in this as well. And basically, by 1947, Great Britain has decided we can't really figure out what to do here. And so mid-1947, Great Britain basically turns the area of Palestine over to the United Nations. It essentially says, here, you handle this. Because as these populations are changing drastically, as you might imagine, there are periods of unrest. There are clashes between these waves of immigrants and the native Arabs. Although that's certainly not the entire story, because there's plenty of stories of coexistence and peaceful living together during this entire time. But it's a very difficult situation that Great Britain turns over to the United Nations in April of 1947. Later in 1947, the UN comes out with what they call the Partition Plan, the UN Partition Plan. And it is a plan to divide the land of Palestine into two independent states. And the map here on your left illustrates this UN partition plan. The areas in green would be a Palestinian state. The areas in the other color here would be a Jewish state, the state of Israel. With Jerusalem being an international city that would be administered by the UN. In other words, neither state would have exclusive rights to Jerusalem. It would be shared, if you will, between the Palestinian state and the Jewish state. Now, again, keep in mind, in the background here, other nations round about have taken shape just in the prior few decades. All right? Again, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Iran. They have all solidified in the decades leading up to this following World War I. So my point being that prior to this particular proposal by the UN, there was no single state, if you will, here. There were lots of Jews living here. There were lots of Arab Muslims living here. There were a fair number of Christians living here, but there was no clearly demarcated independent nation state prior to 1947. These lines may look kind of goofy, but they are the result of the UN kind of doing the best job they could, quite frankly, of being respective of where the majority of Jews lived, where the majority of Palestinians lived, and trying to kind of include in the Palestinian state the most of the concentrations of Arab Muslim population, and then here the most concentrations of Jewish population. So there's a logic to kind of the seeming randomness of those lines. So this plan is put forth by the UN Partition Plan. Essentially, the Jewish inhabitants of this land, we're all good with it. Yay. We vote yes. However, the Arab Muslim population absolutely outright rejected it. And so, in May 14th, actually, of 1948, when David Ben-Gurion officially declared the sovereignty of the State of Israel, formally accepting the UN Partition Plan, war broke out. And the Palestinians, the Arab Muslims who lived in this land, were joined by Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq in attacking the Jewish population here, to say no to this partition plan that would divide the land into two brand new independent states. The result of that would be not really a clear victory for anyone, but a ceasefire that was negotiated by the UN in 1949, July 1949. It was a UN armistice, a ceasefire. The result, however, of that ceasefire and what happened in between, you have to move from this map to this one. Essentially, Israel, and we can speak of Israel again because as of May 14th, 1948, we have now a state of Israel. Again, with the slight exception of the Maccabees in the 150s, 160s BC, really for the first time since the days of David and Solomon. As a result of that war, Israel actually gains territory. You see these dotted lines, and you notice how the green has shrunk. So Israel actually took additional territory on top of what the UN partition plan was going to give. And so that's why you see the green areas have shrunk, and the dotted lines refer to the original UN plan. In the aftermath, then, you have Israel with more territory. Egypt, which had been in on the war that broke out in 1948, Egypt laid claim and continued to control what we now know as the Gaza Strip. The country of Jordan took a claim upon this area and controlled it. It's known as the West Bank. It's strictly a geographic designation because this is the area that after 1948, 1949, the country of Jordan controlled. Here's the Jordan River on the west side, on the west bank of the Jordan River. That's why it's called the West Bank. So after 1948, 1949, Israel has additional territory. Egypt controls this area. The country of Jordan controls this area. Now, one of the things that happened in 1948, 1949 that's so relevant to what's going on today is the beginnings of the refugee crisis. All these black dots indicate Palestinian villages, okay? Villages where Arab Muslims lived when the UN partition plan was put into place and the war broke out and Israel took additional territory. And in the midst of all that happening, 1948, 1949, there's about 500 villages here that were destroyed in the fighting. Estimates of around 700 to 800,000 Arab Muslim Palestinians in these villages that fled either to the Gaza Strip or to the West Bank, some to Lebanon, some to Syria, some into Jordan proper. Now, why did they flee? Well, actually, some fled out of fear before the war even broke out. When this partition plan was being put forth in late 1947, because of the unrest that was already stewing and stirring, many left before the war even started. Many left out of fear during the war, all right, May 1948 through about July 1949. Many, however, were forced out. Many were forced out by the Israeli military as it pushed and took more territory than the UN partition plan had granted to it. There are stories of many who were told that they needed to leave because it was not safe, that they would be allowed to return. However, that opportunity to return never came because in many cases, after a village was evacuated, it was destroyed by the Israeli military. And let me just go ahead and make one thing very clear here. When I say that the Israeli military, that Israel is responsible for many of these villages being evacuated and destroyed and their residents becoming refugees, that's not to say that those actions are representative of all the Jewish people. One of the things that we have to keep in our mind throughout this history and to this modern day, that something the government does, and even parts of the military may do, is not necessarily representative of the people, the common people, the citizens. For example, I think it's pretty fair to say that whether we talk about the prior presidential administration here in the U.S. or the current one, that it would be very easy to find individuals who would say, well, that administration's not doing what I would think it should do. I don't agree with what it's doing. Well, likewise, just because you have Israeli military destroying villages, we can condemn that without saying, well, the whole spread of Jewish people in this entire region, bad. That's a sweeping generality that just does not hold up. But this did happen. And that's why today, for instance, we have over 2 million people in this little strip of land that we'll talk more about in just a little while. That's why to this very day, there are huge refugee camps. Now, when I say camps, I don't mean tent cities. All these decades later, we have actual buildings, but they're refugee areas nonetheless. They are inhabited by, and you have these even in the country of Jordan. These individuals and their descendants who became refugees in 1948, 1949, that have never been able to go home. That really is a key issue in the ongoing hostilities and tensions and conflict. There were Palestinian refugees. You should know that there were also Jewish refugees continuing to flee areas as well. Post-1948, much like we see today, there are very strong international opinions as to what's going on right now. And we see, in fact, right now, many Jews that are being threatened, feeling threatened. That was also the case internationally after 1947, 1948, 1949, the establishment of the State of Israel. And so you can see here, just from the region surrounding the State of Israel, Northern Africa, Iran, Iraq, these areas, about 800,000 Jews fleeing these nations because they were being targeted, if you will, because of what was happening right here in Israel proper. And so just one example to note is that in what became after World War I, the country of Iran, in 1948, there was some 150,000 Jews living in Iran. By 2017, which is when this map was drawn, 10. So we have a refugee situation among the Palestinians, absolutely, for sure. We also have a refugee situation with Jews, not just prior to 1947 and 48 and 49, but continuing after it. The next major conflict surrounding the State of Israel would be the 6 Days War, because it lasted 6 days. June 5 through 10, 1967. And this was a conflict in which Israel actually acted preemptively. It was pretty clear that Egypt and Jordan and Syria were gathering forces about and were preparing for an attack upon Israel. Israel counterattacked preemptively, and once again, Israel came out on top of the military encounter. And after this 6-day war concluded in June 1967, Israel actually took additional territory. What's now known as the Golan Heights was taken from Syria. Israel actually annexed that officially in 1980, 1981. The Golan Heights was taken from Syria. The West Bank, which after 1948 and up until now had been controlled by Jordan, Israel militarily occupied the West Bank. So Jordan is no longer in charge and control of the West Bank. And Israel militarily occupied the Gaza Strip, so it's no longer controlled by Egypt as it had been since 1948. And Israel actually took the entirety of the Sinai Peninsula. So this is the map post-1967. The State of Israel, as it stood at the end of the 48 war, plus an occupation of the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, the Golan Heights, and the Sinai Peninsula. Now, one thing to note, I actually meant to mention this earlier, but it works here just as well. And again, in terms of the modern, what we see going on right now. How a conflict is described very much hinges upon who is describing it. What I mean by that is, for example, in the 48 war, where Israel actually ended up taking additional territory, in addition to what the UN was granting in the partition plan, To this day, Israel will call that war, the 48 War, the Jewish War for Independence, because it was the establishment of the state of Israel, and a war that was fought against those who staunchly opposed the founding of that state. However, the Palestinians, the Arab Muslims, who lost territory, whose villages were destroyed, who were turned into refugees as a result of that conflict, to this day call that war in Arabic the Nakba, which translates as the disaster or the catastrophe. By the way, the 1967 war didn't help the refugee situation. It only complicated it and amplified it. The next major conflict would come in 1973, the Yom Kippur War, when Russia, Syria, and Egypt attacked. It's called the Yom Kippur War because they chose to attack on the Jewish holiday, the very high holiday of Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. Nothing really changed. The status quo was maintained. Nobody gained anything over anyone else. That particular war might ring a bell in your mind because it was rough, almost to the day, the 50th anniversary of that war, that the October 7 attack happened in October. It's after the Yom Kippur War that we start to see some hope, I would say, for resolution. In 1979, that's the date of the Camp David Accords that were negotiated in no small measure due to the work of Jimmy Carter. The Camp David Accords was essentially a peace treaty between Israel and Egypt. And in the Camp David Accords, one of the things that happened there was Israel ceded the entirety of this Sinai Peninsula that they had taken in 1967 back to Egypt. Maintained military occupation of the Gaza Strip, but the entire Sinai Peninsula was given back to Egypt. So, since 1979, more or less, there has been a relative peace between Egypt and Israel. Another major step would come in 1993, and this is called the Oslo Accords. The Oslo Accords, Bill Clinton was a major player in this. The Oslo Accords essentially boiled down to, okay, can we try to get back to the intent of the UN partition plan and see the establishment? We've got a Jewish state, Israel, but to move now again towards having also alongside it an independent Palestinian state. Call it a UN partition plan 2.0 or revisited. Can we move towards what's known as a two-state solution? The way this looked in the West Bank, to move towards the West Bank being an independent or part of an independent Palestinian state, was that it was divided into three areas, still to this day known as areas A, B, and C. Area A would be areas that would be totally under Palestinian control. Major centers of population like Nablus, like Jenin, like Ramallah, like Jericho, like Bethlehem, like Hebron. There would be other areas that would be under joint Israel-Palestinian control. As I'm going to show you in just a moment, one of the reasons for this is the presence of Jewish settlements in these areas, which is another area that we'll have to talk about. And then 60%, as you see, would be under, at least for the time being, complete Israeli control. So areas A, B, and C, Palestinian control, joint Israeli-Palestinian control, Israeli control. Again, the point being, this is a starting point. Here's how we're going to begin to move towards the West Bank being a part of an emerging independent Palestinian state. Now, that seemed to be a good way to start. And for a while, it seemed like it might be heading in a positive direction. For example, by 2006, we have a formal agreement between the Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas and the Prime Minister of Hamas, actually, that they would recognize the existence of the State of Israel if Israel would follow through on this and completely pull back to the 1967 borders. One complication to that, however, is that in the intervening decades, there have been, in the West Bank, the establishment of what's known as Jewish settlements. And I want to show you this picture because when we say a settlement, we don't mean a couple of RVs parked on a hill somewhere. We mean the establishment of full-fledged towns in the West Bank, in what many would rightly call occupied territory. This is a map of the settlements, the Jewish cities and towns that Israel has established in the West Bank. All those blue dots are settlements. There's a lot of them. Many of these settlements are established on land whose acquisition is questionable on Israel's part. Many of these settlements are on land confiscated by Israel because no deed of ownership could be shown by anyone to say you can't do this. The problem is, just because you can't show legal documentation doesn't mean that your family hasn't been on that land for centuries. And that's where a lot of Palestinians found themselves in this scenario. In the turmoil of the 1900s, all the way from World War I, the British Mandate, the Partition Plan, the war, and how things changed hands among governments so much, I would be quite surprised if anyone could provide some legal documentation that, oh yeah, my family's been living here for 150 years. And so as a result, ancestral farmland, in many cases, was lost, was taken away from Palestinians. Now again, let me clarify something. It is not the intention of all Israelis to establish settlements. That's not the case. That has been a government policy, one against which many Israelis have spoken out against, saying this is not right. We're going in and in many cases taking land and establishing towns and cities in, to say the least, contested territory. And basically the reason for this is because there are elements, I do say elements because I don't mean to say everyone, but there are elements of the Israeli government that don't want a two-state solution, that don't want a Palestinian state, that want a single Jewish state in this whole land. And so one of the ways that you can work against that, if you can plant enough of these settlements, then you can say, hey, how could we possibly ever say, well, here, make this a Palestinian state? What we find oftentimes is that when we begin to see a move towards a potential peace, there are those elements who don't want two states that will intervene and basically derail the process. I think these settlements are one example of that. Again, this is not the intent, the policy of all Israelis. It's not. And I do know, I've met people, I've talked to people in some of these settlements that are adamant that they mean for these settlements to be a bridge to peace, a bridge to say we live together, we don't live separated. Unfortunately, the result has not always been that. Despite the increase in settlements, though, post-Oslo, 1993, the move towards the establishment of a Palestinian state continued. I mentioned just a minute ago, in 2006, the agreement reached between Mahmoud Abbas and the Prime Minister of Hamas, of Ismail Haniyeh, to recognize a Jewish state, if that meant Israel would pull back to its borders of 1967 and allow the rest to become a Palestinian state. That was the whole purpose of the Oslo Accords, to move in that direction. However, there are elements on the Israeli side and on the Palestinian side who do not want to see two states. Now, something rather significant happened in 2005. Rather significant. In 2005, then Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, let's go back here a moment. Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, in a rather remarkable move towards trying out, if you will, a two-state solution, ordered all of the settlers, the Jewish settlers in the Gaza Strip, to leave. No choice. Get out. It was something that he was rather strongly criticized for by many Israelis. But it was a unilateral exit of the Gaza Strip. 1,800 families, about 20 some odd settlements, they were forced to leave. It was the Israeli government's way of saying, okay, we're going to try this. We're going to leave Gaza. We're going to absolutely pull back and exit Gaza. And this is going to be another step towards the establishment of a Palestinian state. It really was a remarkable move on Israel's part. Unfortunately, what happened in the aftermath of that, the Palestinian Authority, who was the Palestinian government organization really since the Oslo Accords in 1993, 1994, lost control of Gaza to Hamas, the group whose name we now know so well. Hamas was founded in the 1980s, and it was founded, and the actual name Hamas means violence. I mean, that's what the word Hamas means. That tells you a little something about their approach. Hamas was founded with the stated purpose of ridding this area of the Jews, for there not to be a Jewish state anywhere between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. Hamas won elections. Now, those elections are questioned, but won elections in 2006 and gained control of the Gaza Strip as the governing authority in the Gaza Strip after Israel pulled out, and left. Unfortunately, most unfortunately, ever since then, we've had time after time after time of there being attack, rocket fire by Hamas out of Gaza into Israel. Let me just remind you of the last 10 or 15 years. June 25th, 2006 is when the rocket fire began, not long after Hamas had won control of the government in the Gaza Strip. That was June 2006. The UN brokered a ceasefire in August because, of course, Israel responded to that rocket fire. February of 2008, less than 2 years later, more rockets are being fired out of Gaza into Israel by Hamas. Of course, Israel responds and counterattacks, destroying some of the places from which those rockets were being fired. That would turn into an all-out conflict from November 2008 to January 2009, which resulted in another ceasefire in January of 2009. March of 2012, more rockets come out of Gaza into Israel. Israel again responds with airstrikes, taking out weapons caches in the Gaza Strip. November of 2012, we're there again. More rockets being fired, more response by Israel, another ceasefire that ends the fighting. And the problem with ceasefire is it's good to reach a ceasefire, but if that doesn't really solve what got us in the battle in the first place, then we really hadn't gotten anywhere. And there's more instances that I could continue over the last series of years leading up to 2023 of rocket fire and of Israel responding, and after a period of time, a ceasefire. Also in the background, also happening, is what's known as the first and second intifadas. Intifada just means a popular uprising, an uprising by not by a military force, but by the citizens, the people. The first was from 1987 to 1993. It was an uprising of many of the Arab Palestinian citizens carrying out, just individual shootings, knifings, attacks against Israel. Notice the 1993 date that the Oslo Accords hit on that same year. That kind of brought an end to that first uprising. A second Intifada uprising broke out in September of 2000, which was largely sparked when Ariel Sharon, in a very brash way, went up onto the Temple Mount with an entourage, an area that's controlled by the Muslims, to pray, and sparked this second uprising, which would last until about 2005. This was a period when tourism came almost to a halt again, when we had suicide bombings. This is the years from 2000 to 2005 of the suicide bombers, which gave rise to Israel's idea of building, again, depending on who you ask, what you call this thing, a security wall. Others would say a separation wall, to put it mildly. but a barrier that would be built all the way around the West Bank. Israel's position was, we've got suicide bombers coming over and blowing up buses and restaurants. We got to stop them. So now you have this concrete wall around the West Bank, whose construction began in 2002. One of the problems with it is, notice the path of the line. It doesn't just follow what's called the green line, the 1967 border of the West Bank. Notice how it kind of comes in and comes way in and makes crazy incursions way into the West Bank. And the reason for those incursions is because this is where we find many concentrations of Jewish settlements. So in effect, it's a way of Israel grabbing additional land. And I can tell you from personal experience of seeing this, there are places where this wall cuts right across a Palestinian farmer's farmland and just cuts it in two. Here's what it looks like. It's this huge concrete wall. And I want to show you in this next shot how, notice how it comes around here, effectively just surrounding this little Palestinian village in one of these crazy turns here. The problem with this wall, one of the many problems with this wall, well, number one, guess what? After it was built, no more suicide bombers. Israel would say, see, it worked. Well, the problem is Palestinians, residents of the West Bank, who for years have worked in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv and other areas in Israel, now have to go through gateways, checkpoints, every single day. Doctors who live in the West Bank and work in Jerusalem. Unfortunately, and again, things that happen aren't always representative of most people's opinion. Oftentimes these checkpoints, these gateways, are places of great humiliation and intimidation for Palestinians, kind of depending on who's in charge of the gateway on that particular day. I've heard stories of doctors who literally have not been able to get through and get to their patients in the hospitals because they've been held up for hours because, the gate's going to be 2 hours opening today. Or, we need to search your car, trunk, hood, everything today. Even though, yeah, I see you're a doctor that comes through here every day. No, you pull over there. And so as a result, the West Bank has been suffocated. This is the walled-off hotel. And it's called such because you can see the security wall. It wraps around, literally right in front of it. And so they came to be known then as the walled-off hotel. I met someone in Bethlehem a number of years ago. He was selling little trinkets, little necklaces, little souvenir trinkets. Street side vendor. And I got to talk with him a little bit and learned that he had, I forget what it was, but it was some very advanced degree, like in chemical engineering or something that he had. But there's no work. He couldn't get a job. No way to use his degree because there was nothing for him in the West Bank, in Bethlehem where he lived. And because of this, he couldn't get the passage he needed back and forth to get regular employment over in Israel. And so this guy with a super advanced degree has to resort to selling, little cheap trinkets to tourists to try to support his family. That's the breeding ground of despair and hopelessness. And despair and hopelessness can get deep and profound enough that it can lead to people doing some pretty irrational things. There's also a wall around the Gaza Strip. It was actually started in 1994, but it was intensified after Hamas gained control in 2006. And it was actually after Hamas gained control that Israel also, and it's not just Israel, this is also Egypt, has a blockade in place. It's about 6 miles out into the Mediterranean and even into Egypt. There is a blockade of Gaza that carefully monitors what goes in, what comes out, because Iran is a very open sponsor of Hamas, of Hezbollah, which is another organization that is radically opposed to the existence of a state of Israel. They're based primarily in Lebanon, but this blockade is meant to keep Iran from shipping weapons in to Hamas. Now, the flip side of that is you've got 2 million people living here, and that blockade also keeps, or at least hinders, necessities, food, medicines, all the things that any people need to live from getting in. And with the Gaza Strip being so closed off, that also means that you're limited in your employment, what farming you can do. Here's a good way to, let me just share with you just how big this little piece of land is we're talking about here. At its maximum, it's 25 miles this way. And this way, it's anywhere from 3.7 to about 7.5 miles wide. That comes out to 141 square miles. And over 2 million people are living in there. I live in Newberry County, and I just looked it up just out of curiosity. Newberry County, little old Newberry County, is 647 square miles. That's only 141. We don't have 2 million people in Newberry County. Not even close. Additionally, inside the fence, the wall here, there is a strip that varies from about 300 up to about 600 meters. It's kind of a no man's land, a buffer zone, if you will, between Gaza and Israel. And one of the sad things about that is it eats up as much as 25% of what would be good farmland in the Gaza Strip, because that buffer zone is not on the Israeli side, it's on the Gazan side. And so it's really a very difficult situation in Gaza. Now, Israel would say, and would say rightly so, we tried. We left. We forced 1,800 Jewish families to get out, to let the two-state solution move forward. And look what happened. Hamas took over and has been firing rockets at us ever since. And so, of course, we blockade. Of course, we build a wall. Of course, we keep things very tight. Well, people of Gaza would say, you're suffocating us. You've got 2 million people imprisoned. Hopelessness, despair, hunger, unemployment is rampant. Why are you surprised when a few rockets come over? So it's a very difficult and complicated situation, to say the least. In 2020, under the Trump administration, we saw the beginnings of what's called the Abraham Accords. Again, what looked like maybe the beginnings of some pathway to a solution. It's called the Arab-Israeli Normalization Agreement. An agreement that is, quote, for peace, cooperation, constructive diplomacy, and friendly relations. And the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Sudan, Morocco had already signed on. And it's no accident that leading up to October 7th, Saudi Arabia was getting very close to officially signing on, to actually recognizing the existence of a state of Israel. I think as much as anything else, that's what prompted Hamas to do what they did on October 7th. Because Hamas, as other factions among Arab Palestinians, absolutely will not be open to the existence of a Jewish state. Hamas's charter is the annihilation of the Jewish people from the entirety of this land. And so October 7th happened. And what do you know? Now the talks with Saudi Arabia are on ice. Whether it be the settlements, whether it be rocket fire, whether it be a god-awful, horrific massacre, it seems that when we get close to moving forward with some kind of a peace, an agreement, radical factions come out of the dark and do things that see no limit to derail it. And I want to be very clear again. I think that has happened numerous times on the Palestinian side. And there's also plenty of things that the Israeli government has done over the years that have also complicated and bogged down any potential move towards two states existing peacefully side by side. This gives a pan of what's happened over the last 70 or so years. That prior to 1947 and the UN's partition plan, there were Jews certainly living all across this land. But for the most part, it was known, even if not officially so, as a nation, as the land of Palestine, where Arab Muslims had lived and farmed and for centuries, centuries upon centuries. There were Jews still here, but there were Arabs and Palestinians here as well. The UN partition plan proposes this division. But after the 1948 war, which remember Israel calls the War for Independence and Palestinians call the catastrophe, Israel has everything in white. And everybody else has been pushed back to the areas in green. And now today, with the proliferation of settlements, Jewish settlements in the West Bank, and there being very little area that the Palestinian Authority has exclusive control over, you can see how the Palestinian areas, it would seem, continue to shrink. Even while even while there is Hamas, there is Hezbollah, there is Iran, saying never, ever, ever will we be okay with, will we accept the existence of a Jewish state. Believe me, I've left a lot of details out in terms of dates and happenings that we could talk about. But I hope I've made the point of how complicated this is, of how taking sides does nobody any good. And let me just share a few personal stories with you to illustrate what I'm talking about. To show how what the Israeli government does isn't necessarily representative at all sometimes of the Israeli people. And what Hamas or Hezbollah might do is so not representative of the Palestinian people. This is back when I first started going to Israel back in the late 90s. And still, as I do now, I'll admit, but certainly then had a lot to learn about this history, this situation. I was still kind of in the camp of, oh, all Jews hate all Palestinians and they all just want to kill each other, which is kind of the impression you get from the news sometimes. We were staying at a place on the Dead Sea. It's a Jewish kibbutz called En Gedi. Beautiful, beautiful little place. It's Jewish, very Jewish kibbutz. Our bus driver was an Arab, Muslim, and I just happened to overhear a very interesting conversation when we were checking in to the kibbutz. It was our itinerary was such that we weren't going to need the bus for at least a day and a half. And the driver, Siam, he lived in Jerusalem. And I had heard him say, well, he was just going to go back to Jerusalem. That's where he lives. That's where his wife and kids were. So since we didn't need the bus, he was just going to go back to Jerusalem. And he'd be back to pick us up when it was time to move on to the next place again. And I just happened to be standing in the right place to overhear a conversation between Siam and Mickey, the Jewish guy who was behind the desk as we were checking in. And now, clearly this wasn't the first time these two had met, but still, this Jewish hotel guy behind a desk is talking to this Arab Muslim bus driver and says to him, hey, heard you say you're going back to Jerusalem. If you like, pick up your wife and kids and bring them back, and y'all just enjoy the kibbutz here while the group is doing whatever they're doing. And that just kind of floored me. That this very obviously Jewish guy would make such an offer to this Arab Muslim bus driver. Oh yeah, sure, bring your family back. Just hang out here. Enjoy the place. You don't hear about that in the news. It doesn't mean it doesn't happen. Actually, it does. Every day. Very, very often. Arabs, the Palestinian people, the Israelis, the majority of those are great people and want to live together and do live together very peaceably every single day. When I do take groups to Israel, typically one entire day we spend is coming through the West Bank. And I always have passengers whose families hear that we're going to spend a whole day in the West Bank. They're like, are you crazy? Now, there are a couple of areas where we don't go that we really wouldn't have a reason to go anyway, but that tend to be the flare-up spots that we do avoid. But what I consistently find is that after our one day visiting a few places, Samaria, the Church of Jacob's Well in Nablus, for instance, consistently groups tell me, you know what, that was one of our most favorite days of the whole trip. Because the food we had, the people we met, the hospitality we felt was just amazing. And they come away realizing, oh, the West Bank isn't just an enclave of terrorists. No, it's where common, everyday, ordinary, good, genuine people live every single day. I'll share a story with you out of this current conflict that is a little bit of hope. One of the hostages that has been released is an older Jewish woman that lived right here along the perimeter. Her husband is actually still being held. But she was released, and of course she was being interviewed about, what can you tell us about everything? And she was describing how the tunnel system that Hamas has, she described it like a spider web. But what caught my attention is something she said about one of her captors. Well, I don't think one of the people who actually kidnapped her, but it was one of the Hamas members that was, for lack of a better term, guarding her. And she said that at one point, when he had the opportunity, he said to her, "I believe in the Quran and I will not harm you." And I was really struck by that. To learn that even among those who would claim, who are among Hamas, that even among that group, there are some in their heart that can look at a Jewish woman and say, I know what happened isn't right, and I'm not going to harm you. And she also revealed that in her recent life, the last 10 or 12 or so years, that she had actually devoted her life to helping Palestinians in the Gaza Strip that needed more extensive medical care than they could receive there, that she had made it her life's work over the last 10 or 12 years to help Gazans, to transport Gazans to Jerusalem, to Tel Aviv, even to Haifa, to get medical care that they needed. And so again, that's just to say, because one group or one government does something, don't think that's representative of a whole people, a whole nation, a whole ethnicity, a whole religion, because it's not. I have wonderful friends in Israel that I love, that I trust, who are Israeli. Some even that live in settlements and are using their presence there as a way of working towards peace and building bridges. I also have friends, acquaintances that I love, that I trust impeccably, who are Arab, Muslim, Palestinian. Remember that there are real people, real faces, families that are behind all the news headlines. And that what is happening is harmful to everyone. Loss of innocent life is overwhelming. For Palestinians, for Arabs, for Israelis, the tour buses are parked. The hotels are empty. The restaurants, the souvenir shops, they're closed because there are no customers. People's livelihoods screech to a halt overnight. And there's lots of Israelis. There's lots of Palestinians who are being harmed by that. I hope this looks a bit more complicated to you now than perhaps it did before. I'll leave you with this. One dear acquaintance in Israel is Father Elias Shakur. If you're not familiar with that name, I encourage you to look him up. Elias Chacour. He was a young boy in 1948, and his village in the Galilee up north was one of those that was evacuated but then destroyed by the Israeli military. And rather than taking the path of violence and violent resistance, he became a priest and devoted his entire life to working for peace, working for understanding, building bridges. And the way he did that was through education. He established a school in the Galilee. It's known as Mar Elias Educational Institutions. And he has used education as a means of understanding, of building bridges. And now this school it brings together Christians and Muslims and Jews as students, as instructors, as staff, everyone coming together to learn and be together. But one of the things that Father Shakur said one time is what I want to leave you with. One of the folks in a group, after he had spoken, said, "Father Shakur, I really appreciate all you've said, but I got to say, I think now I'm more confused than I was when I came here." And without missing a beat, he just looked at the fella and smiled and said, "But what's wrong with confusion? When you're not so sure you've got everything figured out, when you feel confused a bit, that might just be when God can speak to you, can enter into your heart and teach you something." And I think he's exactly right about that. The moment we think we know the right answer, the moment we think we know who's right and who's wrong, we've closed ourselves off, and in our own little way, we've made matters worse. So I just ask you to be open, to watch the news with, I'm not going to say a grain of salt, a whole jug full of salt, and realize that there's a lot of stories about a lot of good people who are suffering on all sides of this that you don't hear about. Pray for them. Pray with them. Pray that all God's people, all Abraham's children, Jew, Christian, and Muslim, might in some way that only God can bring about know peace and stability and life in all its fullness in this land and everywhere. Thank you for your time, and if you would like to discuss more, if you would like to have, for instance, me come to your congregation or maybe a gathering of congregations and share more information and lead discussion, I think that's very important to do, and I'd be very happy to do that. Probably the easiest way to contact me is at my email, just my first and last name, Bobby Morris, BOBBYMORRIS, at outlook.com. And I'll be glad to help you with that as I'm able. Thank you very much.